Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Drs. Joby Czarnecki and Beth Baker. Cover crops are often lauded as agricultural heroes, boasting of a variety of ecosystem services and benefits to farmers in the world. But are these crops always the best option, and do they always provide benefits wherever they go? In this episode, Joby and Beth join me for a more nuanced look at the benefits of cover crops and how research can make sure farmers are really applying the best strategies for their farms. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today we have Joby and Beth with us. Joby Czarnecki is an associate research professor with the Geosystems Research Institute at Mississippi State University. She's focused on how geospatial technologies can enable growers to target placement of conservation practices on the landscape to reduce the environmental stress of production agriculture without compromising the bottom line. Beth Baker is an associate extension professor in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture at Mississippi State University. Her work focuses on conservation delivery and adoption, natural resource conservation in agroecosystems, and conservation impact assessments. Hello, Joby and Beth. Welcome to the show. How are you both doing today?
Hey, good morning. Doing well, thanks.
I'm also doing well. It's a beautiful day in Mississippi. Sun is shining. Birds are singing. It's a beautiful day to work in agriculture.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we're getting close to lovely spring weather in Wisconsin here. We're seeing bits and pieces. But today, we wanted to have you on the show because you wrote a paper about cover crops and some research you did with them, and just kind of reconciling their kind of reputation as a silver bullet and maybe taking a more nuanced view on what it takes to make them work and how successful they can be in certain situations. So can you just tell me a little bit about kind of the problem that you were hoping to address for your farmers in this research and what role you thought cover crops could play in the solution?
Farmers adopt conservation practices with this, specific intention of having a, conservation goal. And so in this study, our conservation practice is winter cover crops, which we did couple with reduced tillage, and our intention is to reduce surface water pollution. So the cover crops here, we grow them during the fallow period, which is our winter, and they aren't going to harvest those for profit. They just serve this single purpose. The intention is that by having that winter cover, especially that is our rainy season, we can protect our soil from eroding and washing away. Cover crops do promote healthy soils by increasing the soil structure and the organic matter, which is one reason that we want to reduce the tillage so we don't undo the hard work that they're doing to build up that structure and organic matter. And overall, that's a better framework for trapping and holding water during the lean times. So while we do have abundant rainfall in Mississippi, it's not always when we need it, especially in the summer, which I think is true of a lot of areas. So we do have a theoretical basis for some, positive outcomes of cover crops. And a lot of the studies, though, that we read are from different areas, like the Midwest, where they just have a different system. And so what we really needed were, sort of studies that could quantify what improvements we could expect in our region. And at the same time, we're also thinking about what does a field scale implementation of that look like? So we wanted to have a field scale study that was managed by the farmer. And because the farmers are the ones implementing it, they're the ones who want to see that the practice works. It needs to fit into what they're already doing, or, because if it's difficult or exceedingly expensive, that's a non-starter for them. So we let the farmers help manage this, and we wanted to quantify the water quality benefits, because if the farmers are going to do it, we obviously want them to see the benefit, but we also want them to get credit for the good work that they're doing, and we do that through quantification. We just don't have a lot of comparable studies available in the literature that speak to our area, and so that's why we set out to do this study, was to have that information for our farmers so that we can guide them in how best to apply them, best practices that we learned, and then just having that real experience from other farmers, I think, is very valuable, because as researchers, yeah, we're smart. We have a lot of technical skills, but that subject matter expertise and that peer relationship that comes from their other farmers is also really important, and we acknowledge that. And so at the end of the day, we're just hoping by the study that we can help them set realistic goals, because obviously if we look at what goes on in other regions, sometimes they work really well, sometimes they don't, but we wanted to set the expectation, especially with the lag time associated with conservation practice adoption. What could you realistically expect after just a couple years? Because as they evaluate if this practice makes sense for their farm, they don't see a profit or see some improvement in a couple of years, it will be hard to continue if there's not someone telling them, like, don't expect it right away, you need to wait. And so that's our problem background.
Yeah, that's great. I love all of that. I'm excited to dig in more. So then when you were implementing this with your farmers, what did you do?
So our hypothesis with the cover crops, based on what we've seen in other areas, is that having these on the landscape is going to reduce the amount of water and soil that leaves the field. Because obviously, if you've protected the soil with the impact of the rainfall, it's not going to dislodge the soil, and it's not going to float it off into the drainage ditch. And so by extension, because most of the surface water pollution is going to come as nutrients dissolved in that water, and also as soil that leaves the field, if we can stop that, then we can reduce the amount of nutrients, and specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, that are leaving the field, carried in the water, and then as far as phosphorus attached to the soil. So we take a single farm field, and we got 6 farmers to take a chance on us. They give us a field, and we divide that in half, and then with help from our partners, we divided that into 2 separate watersheds. And that's going to be very important in how we justify our results. So on one half of the field, the farmers just do what they've always done, which in this region tends to be a fallow winter period. They've bedded up into the fall, they've put out some fertilizer, and then they're just waiting for spring because they want to be ready to go. They don't want any delays. And that's their sort of typical business as usual approach, which is our control in the study. Our treatment is that we now have winter cover crops. We use a blend that we've planted, and then we also reduce a lot of their soil disturbing operations related to post-harvest soil disturbance. So we've reduced their tillage. And then now that it's divided in half, they were either in a corn system or they're in a corn soybean rotation. So some of them are going into corn and some of them are going into soybeans. But once that period comes, they just do both sides the same. So they do the same burn down application, the same pre-emerge herbicides, planting is the same, the management in the summer as far as irrigation and usual inputs, that's all the same. The harvest is the same. And then we start our sort of divergence again, where after they harvest, they aren't doing those soil disturbing operations on the treatment side. They're still allowed to do whatever they want on the control side. And so over the 2-year period, what we're doing as far as the research is the water that's leaving those fields, it is being channeled because it is all of our fields are precision leveled. That's a common practice here. So they do drain to a central point. We're sampling the water from that central point, and we're checking to see between the 2 halves, so our treatment and our control, is there a difference in the water quality? Or, is the nitrogen lower? Is the phosphorus lower? Is there less sediment leaving the field? And we do that over a 2-year period. So every time it rains, the water's running off, it gets collected. And so at this point, because the only real difference that's been affected in that field is the treatment of the cover crops and the reduction in tillage, we attribute any kind of differences we see in that water quality specifically to the treatment we applied. If you had done it alternatively, like if you had this field versus another field down the road, it would be hard to necessarily call that apples to apples because of field management history and just, farmer preference for how they manage things, legacy effects in the soil, things like that. But by taking that single field and dividing it and only changing this one thing, we feel pretty confident that what we're seeing are the true differences that have been affected by this treatment.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like too that you were able to get, a little bit of variety in like corn versus soybean, or a little bit of variety in like the other management practices while still maintaining like this is the only change. So I just love in the field on farm experiments are so fun. So I'm so glad to get to talk to you both about this. So I'm sure everyone is just so excited to hear now. What did you find?
Okay, great question. After 2 years of data collection, we found that we didn't have overwhelming evidence to support water quality improvements. And in order to reduce the potential for pollution, non-point source pollution, to move from these fields, the conservation practices implemented would really need to have either reduced the total volume of water or the nutrients and sediment leaving the field. So like many previous studies, the practices did reduce concentrations of total nitrogen and total phosphorus in the water samples that we collected, which is encouraging. But at the same time, discharge was not reduced. And so therefore the nutrients and sediment continued to leave the field, and accordingly, no major reductions in nutrient loading were observed. But it should be noted that the measured values were highly variable with respect to both concentrations and loads. And specific to the study region, we have particularly high annual rainfall, as well as frequent intensive rain events. Our winters are mild, which you mentioned earlier, with no snow cover. And across the region where this study happened, the soils are generally poorly drained. So all of these things are important to consider in regards to the research, where there has been findings where sometimes heavy rainfall events can undermine annual goals of conservation. And so this study supports the notion that cover crops and reducing tillage doesn't immediately affect nutrient transport. But like most conservation assessments, time here is a critical factor. So having water quality data over a 2-year period gives us a good amount of data. And at the same time, 2 years of implementation is, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly short period of time. So effective integration into our conventional systems really requires a little more patience as well as adaptive management. And more research is needed to really understand the nuances of how these practices fit into our different production systems and how farmers can really optimize both placement and function in the field.
Sure. Yeah. So, as we mentioned at the top of the show, it is kind of this idea that comes up pretty much anywhere in agriculture of there is no silver bullet. There's no one answer. So that's why we really like this research. But it seems like there's a lot of promising, obviously just data to have and ask those initial questions of how can we make this more of a silver bullet, or how can we make them more effective, whether that's combining them with other things or more time, managing rainfall, whatever. So obviously you have a lot more questions to ask and research to do. So can you tell me about where either this specific project or future projects are going, what other research you might be either working on or having finished that's related? Where are we going?
I'll start with some general ideas relative to the findings of the paper, and then maybe we could talk more about other projects that we both have going on. But I would kind of circle back to our findings on the drainage, right? Because if we can continue to enhance infiltration or reduce discharge from the cover crop reduced tillage field, then we would maybe be able to measure more appreciable reductions in nutrient transport. And so going back to our findings, some of the things that are important to keep in mind are that building soil structure as one of the ecosystem services of cover crops or reducing tillage takes a good amount of time. Some papers quote 5 to 10 years. At a minimum, of course, we were monitoring water for 2 years. Alongside that, our reduced tillage treatments were also not no tillage. So that's going to limit the ability of soil structure to be enhanced. So you could think that maybe one of our alternative hypotheses after doing this work is that the additional tillage, particularly subsurface tillage in our control fields, was able to enhance infiltration more than our reduced tillage cover crop treatment, if you will. And I think that's really important to understand because we're also, as we mentioned several times, in an area of high rainfall and poor drainage. So having these tillage tools to enhance drainage in our production systems for agronomic benefit is really important, and research would really need to compensate for that for us to have the same impact in our cover crop reduced tillage system.
Sure. I'm going to jump in with a quick question before I let you move on. Can you explain the difference, just for beginners like mostly me? What is the difference between subsurface tillage and reduced tillage? I mean, I know no tillage is more straightforward, but can you just explain those techniques a little bit more, specifically as they would be applied here?
Yep, you're opening a can of worms, Abby.
I always am.
Well, when I'm referring to subsoiling, that's a deeper tillage treatment that breaks the soil deeper into the ground than a more conventional disking would. And so that's something most of our producers utilize.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because I know there's a lot of nuanced terms involved in many conservation, precision, ag, anything in that area. So I just wanted to help people like me keep up in the conversation.
One thing that's very different here, I would say, as opposed to other areas, and Beth, jump in, is we furrow irrigate. A lot of areas are on pivots. We are not one of those areas. Our growers prefer furrow irrigation, and their sort of directive to anyone who has worked in irrigation research is they want to become very efficient furrow irrigators. So they are by nature going to have to do some soil disturbance to maintain beds to make sure the furrows flow appropriately. So, going to systems that have zero soil disturbance is going to be challenging given some of our other management practices.
Okay. And also, mostly for me, can you please explain the difference between pivot and furrow irrigation?
Sure. So pivot is what sort of iconic farm vision of round circles in fields where you have, and they don't have to be round circles. You can get one that flows straight up, but some kind of apparatus that's going to go across the field and drip water on it, has wheels. You've seen them if you've driven through any kind of farmland that's not in Mississippi. So with the furrow, then what you're going to have is basically a raised bed in a row within a depression. Between the rows, the water will flow down that, and then it can soak in to the sides. And so they run a big pipe, like plastic pipe, down the edge of the field. They punch holes in it, and so the water goes into that, what they call poly pipe, and then the water flows out of that into the furrow. It runs across the field and then hopefully gets soaked up by the plants. It doesn't just keep gushing off the end. They've done actually a lot of work here on how to optimize that to get the water on evenly and soak in appropriately. And so that's one of the reasons, they've improved the efficiency of that in lieu of going to pivots.
If I could jump in though, yeah, she makes a really great point just in describing the bedded system for planting as well as the furrow irrigation, because that is fairly different from areas of the Midwest where you would be flatland farming and have the ability to use a no-till drill across that in whatever configuration you want. Because once these beds are formed, you know exactly which direction the tractor needs to go in terms of planting the cash crop as well as the cover crop that needs to be rolled in the same direction. And so when it comes to conservation delivery and our conservation professionals talking about the implementation of cover crops, it is much more complex than, oh, you were approved from NRCS for a new drainage pipe or a weir or some structural practice that gets just dropped in the farm system and nothing else needs to change, because a lot of things need to change with these cover crop systems.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Joby and Beth's paper, Transitioning from Conventional to Cover Crop Systems with Minimum Tillage Does Not Alter Nutrient Loading, published in the Journal of Environmental Quality, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsor, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/FieldLabEarth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, I'm just imagining even just trying to poke holes in a hose and get water where it needs to go. It just already sounds complicated, let alone combining it with all of these other considerations. Farmers are amazing. we say that a lot, but they're amazing. Go ahead.
They have a really great tool for that, though, where it will tell them where to put the holes and how big they need to be to equalize the pressure so it doesn't rupture the poly pipe. And so that's one of our sort of efficiency improvements is customized hole selection through some programs that are available to farmers.
Yeah.
So they've got it down to a science here.
Yeah.
The system's pretty unique, I would say, to the Mississippi Alluvial Valley region, where in North Mississippi, and if you get into Tennessee, you may see more flatland, no-till farming without the bed system.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, too, that leads into a little bit about just sunk costs. If they've put all of the research effort to figure out how to do this well, and then you're asking them to change and they may not see results right away, that's a valid hurdle to have to overcome. Which I know, Joby, before I needed excessive hand-holding on probably basic terms. You were going to talk more about just some future research projects that you both have coming down the line or are working on now to help farmers implement these successfully. So I will release you to continue post my interruption.
Well, so Beth is probably, Beth and I used to share an office. And so now we still work together, but unfortunately have our own offices. I think we got more done when we were together. But so this project that we're talking about now was funded by USDA CARE program. And so I've got a new CARE funded project that Beth also works on with me, where we're doing more on-farm experimentation. And so I'm pretty excited about that. There's a lot of renewed interest in on-farm experimentation, and other states have set up a program, where farmers can get involved. Mississippi hasn't gotten one as, sort of organized as maybe other states, but we're going for it. So we've got a group of producers who are willing to go on another journey with us, only this time they picked the research topic. They get to decide the treatments. And we bring all of our technical expertise. We will help them improve the rigor in their on-farm experimentation. We will write the analysis tools and help them understand results. But for the most part, they're in the driver's seat, and we are just backup dancers. And I'm excited about that. I'm hopeful that will be a new sort of approach to research that is more directly relevant to farmers. And as you've seen, our systems are different. And so by doing it in their systems with the tools they have, with what interests them, with methods they can actually use, I want to reduce the gap between if I get an idea today, I spend a year trying to get funding, I spend 3 years doing data collection to then write a paper, which of course we will send to be published by tri-societies. And then at some point, a farmer gets to hear a podcast where he learns about what I've done with all my time and money. He no longer cares about that problem. So I'm excited to reduce that, lag time between farmer problem and, robust solution. And so that's sort of where I'm going right now. I also have some work trying to get more value out of all of the small plot research by applying field scale economic decision support to it to make things more accessible to farmers, thinking about how it will actually play out on their field financially and then also spatially. Just a quick example, like if we had a study that said you'd lose $1 an acre if you didn't adopt this practice, and we've demonstrated it in small plots. Well, that's a very different proposition if you're farming 5 acres or 200 acres. How much money are you willing to lose? So being able to scale those things in an easy framework is another area we're moving in. But most of my time is just spent trying to figure out how I can make things easier and more accessible to farmers.
I love that. Huge fan.
So, thank you. My first job was at the Farmers Co-op. I weighed grain trucks, and I can still remember my boss telling me, like, you work for these people. They need to see that you're helping them. And so that's what I've tried to bring to my job as a 100% research appointment who doesn't necessarily get to spend a lot of time meeting with farmers or in the field. Unlike Beth's position, which is entirely 100% extension, where all she does is hang out with farmers and do cool things.
Wonderful. Beth, did you have more research that you're working on or presentations and initiatives with farmers?
Yeah, we do. One of the fun parts of the project that we were discussing throughout the podcast was definitely seeing kind of the breadth of the farmers within our collaboration of how they were experimenting and trying new things. And so one of the great successes of the project too, that wasn't obviously in the paper, was the farmer to farmer extension work that we did. We had several field days, and so several of the farmers in the trials were able to share what they were doing, how they were doing it differently, as opposed to what some of their neighbors were up to. And so we'll continue that extension work in farmer to farmer idea sharing in Mississippi. And I lead some of that work across the whole Mississippi River Basin as well, with several other state partners, one at Wisconsin-Madison, where you are. And actually, Jenny Seifert, who's up there at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, developed a digital platform for us to share these farmer stories more readily, because not everybody can make it to a field day these days. It's actually in some of the supporting resources, the link for the goodideafarm.org. That link actually has farmer videos from all over the Mississippi River Basin where farmers are innovating and trying things and sharing those ideas for other farmers. So that conservation, adoption, and delivery work will continue. And then with Joby and a few other partners from this original project, we should also be endeavoring into a climate smart commodity project, one of those hosted by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And that work will somewhat expand on this project, where we'll be trying to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but using a systems framework. So we'll have the cover crops and reduced tillage as some of our practice focus, alongside advanced nutrient management, using some enhanced efficiency fertilizers and tools for producer fertilizer decision making. I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting a practice there, but taking the practices from this study with some other critical nutrient management practices to see if we can get over this hump of reducing not only nutrient transport, but any nitrous oxide emissions from the nitrogen too. So that's going to be pretty cool when we get that rolling.
Awesome. Long-term listeners, I'm throwing in an extra bonus. Don't be too surprised. So I feel like in this conversation, we've been talking about kind of the usefulness of cover crops, and maybe in this one they didn't do exactly what you were hoping, but I don't want to be like, cover crops are the worst, never use them. What would you say for farmers or researchers would be like some of the bottom line takeaways you had about this, about, the usefulness of cover crops and how you can best use them so that, they are providing the benefits that you hope that they will? What are some takeaways for people on that?
Sure, that's a great question, because we definitely wouldn't want that to be the perception. There are so many different ecosystem services of cover crops, including wildlife value, soil fertility benefits, all kinds of things in the literature outside of what we measured in this study. And so some of the things that we really took away were the specific attention to detail that's needed to integrate these in production systems where they provide more immediate services to producers and less risk. So some of those things would be, rather than, let's say farmer A thinks that their NRCS office has available financial assistance for cover crops. You wouldn't want to give the farmer the idea that buying some seed, broadcasting it across the field, good to go, is all the thought that needs to go into implementing a cover crop, because we've discussed it's a lot more complex than that. So a producer would want to do a fair bit of research on both the financial resources available to them to offset the cost of implementing the cover crop, as well as the technical assistance available to them, to consider and do some research on what would be required for equipment to get the best establishment of cover crop. Is this equipment they have, or is it something more specific like a drill that they're going to need? They're also going to need to do some research on what different species of cover crops would fit into their production system in terms of adequate timing for establishment, in terms of when they're harvesting, in regard to what species fit with their crop rotation, right, to have benefits and not any unintended effects like allelopathic effects. They'd also want to consider the cost of all of those seed species that might be applicable for both what fits in their rotation, what species provide different ecosystem services, and then what species, individual or in a mix, fits with their budget. Lots of things to consider just right there before you even plant. Then you have to get that equipment that you might need for adequate stand establishment, hope that the weather aligns to get it in the time frame that is optimal before a snowfall in the Midwest or whatever drought or rain conditions here in the Mid-South, because that's also a time we can have drought conditions. So then even if you get the seed in the ground, there's not enough moisture for that to come up in some cases. And that's all just on the planting side. Then you have to think about optimal termination timing and how you're going to terminate. Is that going to be a chemical application? And then does that require 2 to 6 weeks ahead of your planned cash crop planting? What is the weather like at that time? When can you get in the field? How do you have to deviate that plan? Do you have the right chemicals? Do you have the right equipment for that? And do you have a game plan for this new residue management that wasn't in your production system before? Because that's not something, if folks are farming on a clean, fallow field, they're not used to residue management. That might require new equipment, more attachments for the planter. All of these things are like things we learned in just like the first year of the trials, and then how to really have the best residue management for cash crop planting to have optimal emergence to reduce risk in that cash crop season, and then do it all over again in the next crop rotation. So there is as much a science to this as an art, and that's very hard to convey in the more simple and typical conversations we have about conservation in farm landscapes.
So Beth, those are great ideas. Another thing to consider is that, we've spent a lot of time and energy, especially our farmers, and optimizing the way they farm corn and soy. So they didn't just in 1 year say, hey, this is how it's going to be, and everyone will do it this way, right? Everybody's got their own method. They've figured out what works, what doesn't work. And that was a multi-year process where they learned from research, they learned from each other, they learned from their own experience. And so just to think that in 1 year they would go out and suddenly become, amazingly good cover croppers as well as corn and soybean rotation farmers is not really very realistic. And so I do want to point out that one thing we saw, this paper is about water quality, but we did also measure things that were of interest to farmers, like economics and specifically yield. We did get yield improvement in the second year. So one of the things we learned specifically about the residue management that Beth mentioned was if you don't deal with that appropriately, it will get pulled into the furrow, and specifically in corn, it limited our seed to soil contact, which hurt our yields. So in the second year, we introduced row cleaners. That solved a lot of our problems. And I mean, the yields we got weren't terrible. The farmers, of course, would have liked to have had more, but they weren't, regionally, they weren't the worst yields we've ever seen, but they could have been better. And so it was an adaptive management process. Going into it, just be aware of that. And just remember, you didn't get to become the corn and soybean farmer that you were overnight. So it's going to take more than a year to optimize cover crops in your operation.
Sure. That is great advice. I'm so glad that we were able to talk a little bit more on the in-depth complexities of cover crops. I have 3 questions left for you. The first one is, where can listeners go if they would like to learn more about any of the things we talked about today?
Okay, so if folks are interested in conservation practices or any of the research here in Mississippi, they can go to our REACH website, which is www.reach.msstate.edu. Of course, for anyone who's a landowner, land manager interested in the conservation practices we talked about today or others, the first thing they're going to want to do is go to their local NRCS office to find out if they're eligible for financial assistance, and also if they can have a technical assistance on understanding if any of these practices are a good fit for their operation, and if there's financial assistance available as well. They can also go to the SARE website, which is Sustainable Agriculture Research and Extension, a USDA website that will have lots of educational resources available. The Southern Cover Crops Council is a fantastic resource, as well as there is a Midwestern Cover Crops Council. Both of those websites have really fantastic resources specific to cover crop species and mixes and technical assistance for producers in the Midwest and in the Mid-South. I know that our Southern Cover Crops Council will be adding in the next few years decision support tools for selecting species and doing some estimations on agronomic and economic returns. So those resources are also evolving. And then the one I mentioned earlier, goodideafarm.org, is where you can find other ideas from producers who are innovating with conservation on their farms.
Sure. And then if listeners want to get involved in this kind of research, what can they do?
Just because you're not farming doesn't mean you can't cover crop your garden. So I think, we've talked a lot about cover crops on the farm, but, a homeowner could also adopt these practices. And you can get, seeds you can put in your garden over the winter to help you also be ready to go for spring planting.
Yeah, that's small scale, but I do think it's important to reiterate that, the main overarching goal with this project was to reduce that nutrient transport. And we do all, as citizens, play a role in mitigating non-point source pollutants. So just being familiar with the issues, perhaps the urban sources of non-point source pollutants that could be transported from the landscape, whether it's your yard, your garden, your driveway, the city you live in. I think that's a great place to start. And knowing that farmers are incredible stewards of the land resources and helping us mitigate these, but everyone plays a role in this.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I have one final question, which is, what is one fun fact that listeners wouldn't know about you if all they had was your research?
I'm of the age now where I saw a meme and it was like binge watching in your 40s as 3 bird feeders at once. And I'm sort of at that point in my life where I'm now completely obsessed with birds and specifically taking photos of birds. I decided, I'd get a camera, and I was sort of an impulse buy, because when you work for university, you get to go lots of cool places. And now I am full on obsessed with photography and birds, and specifically bird photography.
Nice. Do you have a favorite bird?
I do. Thank you for asking. We will put photos in the show notes. I I love Carolina Wren. I love its quirky little personality, and to me, it just seems like if you're familiar with Seinfeld, it's just like the George Costanza of the bird world, with the way it always looks annoyed, but also very happy.
I love that. Wonderful. Beth, what about you?
Well, I'd like to admit that I'm also slowly getting into the birding. Joby, I've just been emailing her about this all the time. Anyway, we have just great backyard birds here in Mississippi, which is really fun.
Come join me in my birding tent, Beth. I'm telling you, I have a blind set up in the yard just to watch them play.
I've been stalking this eastern bluebird who refuses to come into my yard but hangs out nearby. But other than that, I do like to get in some physical activity. So I've been trying to train for this mountain race I want to do. And I'm just hopeful that my body stays together in order to do that this fall, but we'll see.
Sure. Is that like mountain biking, running?
Running,
oh, wow.
Running. Yeah, I've done a couple marathons, but this one particularly has a lot of elevation and up to 14,000 feet. So I just don't know that I'll be able to breathe, right? But we'll find out when I get there.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you can breathe and successfully run your race. Love the bird stuff. I enjoy watching them in my own backyard. They're just beautiful and make me happy. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate this closer look at cover crops and all the research that you're both doing to help our farmers do what they do, which is great stuff. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today we'll be talking to Augustine. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity of being on the show. My name is Agustin Olivo. I'm originally from Argentina, and I'm currently on the third year of my PhD program at Cornell University. I'm part of the Nutrient Management SPEAR program, which is an applied research and extension team within the Department of Animal Science. I did my undergrad back in Argentina, then a master's degree at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and in 2020, I started my PhD program here at Cornell.
Awesome. And what are you currently researching?
Yeah, so currently in my program, I'm conducting a few different projects and research and extension projects that are mostly focused on strategies to improve environmental sustainability of dairy systems. For example, the objective of one of them includes characterizing greenhouse gas emissions and nutrient use efficiency in dairy systems through a few different whole farm decision support tools, such as the whole farm nutrient mass balance, another is called Cool Farm Tool, and Comet Farm. In those tools, we're also testing the impact that beneficial management practices implemented at the farm level may have on the environmental outcomes I described. Furthermore, I'm also working on a different project trying to benchmark field-level nitrogen balances in corn silage production in New York that allows dairy producers to reduce nitrogen losses at the field level to minimize things like greenhouse gas emissions and water quality impacts. But also to maximize the use of on-farm nitrogen sources and reduce input cost. And finally, I'm also working in another very fun project where we're implementing a curriculum on environmental sustainability of agriculture and whole farm nutrient mass balances across more than, I think, 20 high schools in the state of New York. So that's been a really good one to be part of.
Wow, that's awesome. And if you could have your dream project, what would that be?
Yeah, I think this was a hard question because I feel like I have a lot of interest in projects I would like to do. But when I read the question, one of the things that came to mind was the idea of conducting research with livestock farms back in Argentina, where I'm from. And livestock systems in Argentina have experienced some level of intensification process over the last few decades that has helped increase efficiency in one side, but also brought a few different challenges from the environmental perspective. So I think I would love to conduct applied research at the farm level to explore things like the soil health and the nutrient value of manure, strategy to help those farms optimize nutrient management, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also potentially helping at the policy level to help steer management in that direction in farms back home.
Awesome. If you'd like to get in touch with Augustine about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.